October 1st, 331 BC, Alexander is about to make the worst decision of his life. Across the plain of Gaugamela, Darius III has assembled the largest army ever recorded in the ancient world. 200,000 men by conservative estimates, 2,000 scythed chariots, war elephants, and an elite cavalry that outnumbers the entire Macedonian force. He has personally flattened the ground to give his chariots maximum killing range. He has chosen the terrain, the date, and the formation. Every single advantage belongs to Persia, and yet this is not the story of a heroic charge against impossible odds. It's the story of a trap Alexander had been building for 2 years, and Darius walked straight into it. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly how a 25-year-old with 47,000 men dismantled the most powerful empire on earth in a single afternoon.
From the ashes of the first great wars rise the names the world has lost. Every throne was built on blood and scars, every crown a final cost. These are the wars that time erased, the kings who ruled and were replaced. Written in stone, remembered in flame, the war archives reclaims their name.
When Alexander the Great died, there was no heir, there was no plan. There was only an empire too big for any one man to hold, and 8 generals willing to kill for it. June 323 BC, Babylon, in the palace of the ancient Babylonian kings. The same palace where Nebuchadnezzar had held the captive peoples of the world. Alexander the Great lay dying. Outside the great walls, the Euphrates ran as it had for thousands of years. The hanging gardens breathed in the heat of a Mesopotamian summer. And inside, in a room thick with incense and the unspoken grief of great men, the greatest conqueror the world had ever seen was losing the one battle he could not win. He was 32 years old. To understand how catastrophic his death was, you have to understand what he had built and how fast he had built it. When Alexander inherited the throne of Macedonia in 336 BC, following the assassination of his father Philip II, he was 20 years old. Macedonia was a respected but regional power, formidable by Greek standards, but nothing compared to the Persian Achaemenid Empire, which had ruled the known world for over 2 centuries. In the 12 years that followed, Alexander dismantled that world and replaced it with his own. He crossed into Asia in 334 BC with approximately 37,000 men. Within 2 years, he had destroyed the Western Persian satrapal system and liberated the Greek cities of Asia Minor. At the Battle of Ipsus in 333 BC, he faced the Persian king Darius III in person and routed him, capturing Darius's mother, wife, and daughters. He swept south through the Levant, besieged the island city of Tyre for 7 months, and took it, entered Egypt as a liberator, and founded Alexandria on the Mediterranean coast, the city that would bear his name for millennia. At the Battle of Gaugamela in 331 BC, He destroyed the main Persian army in the decisive engagement of the entire campaign. Darius fled. Alexander marched into Persepolis, the ceremonial heart of the Persian Empire, and burned it, an act interpreted ever since as either revenge for the burning of Athens or as a moment of drunken excess, possibly both. He pressed east into Bactria and Sogdiana, modern Afghanistan and Central Asia, fighting a brutal, years-long guerrilla war in the mountains and deserts that some historians consider the most difficult phase of his entire campaign. He married Roxane, a Bactrian princess, in 327 BC, a politically controversial choice that alienated many of his Macedonian officers. He then crossed the Hindu Kush and invaded India, winning the Battle of the Hydaspes against King Porus in 326 BC, a battle fought against war elephants in monsoon rain, before his army finally refused to go further. They had been marching and fighting for nearly a decade. They were exhausted, they were homesick, and they were afraid. The Indian subcontinent seemed to have no end. At the Hyphasis River, Alexander's veterans sat down and would not rise. It was the only time in his life Alexander was stopped, not by an enemy, but by the limits of human endurance. He turned back. He led his army through the Gedrosian desert, a catastrophic march through waterless wasteland, in which thousands died of heat, thirst, and exhaustion, and returned to Babylon in 324 BC, where he began planning his next campaign, the conquest of Arabia. He never launched it. In the spring of 323 BC, he fell ill. The ancient sources disagree on the cause. Modern historians have proposed typhoid fever, acute pancreatitis, West Nile virus, and alcoholic liver disease. What they agree on is this: Alexander deteriorated rapidly over approximately 12 days, losing the ability to speak, then losing the ability to move, and dying on or around June 10th or 11th, 323 BC. He was 32 years old. He had conquered more of the known world than any human being before him, and he had made absolutely no arrangements for what would happen next. The men gathered around his deathbed had served him for over a decade. They had crossed every terrain the world possessed. They had won battles that seemed impossible. They had followed him to the edge of the known world and back. Now, they stood in that chamber in Babylon, and they looked at each other, and every single one of them was already calculating. The ancient sources record that when the soldiers were allowed to file past their king, Alexander could no longer speak. He could only acknowledge them with his eyes. When asked who should inherit his empire, the dying king, according to later sources, which are themselves disputed, may have said 3 words: to the strongest. Whether he spoke those words or not, they perfectly described what was about to happen. Because Alexander left behind no clear succession plan, no designated heir who could command universal loyalty, and no administrative mechanism capable of governing an empire this vast, without a single unifying authority at its center. What he left behind was the largest power vacuum in the history of the ancient world. And into that vacuum, 8 men were about to pour everything they had. The men who would tear Alexander's empire apart were not ordinary soldiers. They were the inner circle of the greatest military machine the ancient world had ever produced. They had served under the greatest general of their age, learned war from the source, and accumulated experience, wealth, and political connections that most rulers of the ancient world could only dream of. They knew each other's strengths. They knew each other's weaknesses, and they were about to use every piece of that knowledge as a weapon. History calls them the Diadochi, from the Greek word for successors, and in the 40 years that followed Alexander's death, they would fight 7 major wars, countless campaigns, and dozens of individual battles. Not simply for territory, but for the right to claim the greatest legacy in the ancient world. First of them was Perdiccas, the Chiliarch, the highest military office in the empire, essentially second in command. When Alexander handed him his signet ring in those final hours, Perdiccas received what every other man in the room understood as the closest thing to a designation of authority. He was intelligent, capable, and possessed of a political ambition that consistently outpaced his political judgment. He held power, but not legitimacy, and in the world of the Diadochi, that difference would cost him everything. Perdiccas had another problem that would define the entire succession crisis. He was not of royal blood. He could hold the ring, he could command the army, but he could not call himself king of Macedon without attaching himself to the Achaemenid dynasty, and the Argead dynasty suddenly had no living capable male adult to lead it. The royal family had become a political problem he needed to solve, rather than a source of authority he could simply inherit. The next one was Ptolemy. There is a reason Ptolemy I Soter, the savior, is remembered as the founder of a dynasty that lasted nearly 3 centuries, while men like Perdiccas and Antigonus are remembered as cautionary tales. Ptolemy was the most politically intelligent of all the Diadochi. He had served Alexander loyally, and had even written his own account of Alexander's campaigns, a work that Arrian later used as a primary source and which presented Ptolemy's actions in the most favorable possible light. That tells you something about the man. He understood more clearly than anyone else in that room that controlling a single defensible, wealthy province was worth more than a theoretical claim to an empire you could not physically hold. Egypt was not just a province, it was the richest agricultural land in the ancient world, protected to the west by the Libyan desert, to the east by the Sinai, to the south by the Nile cataracts, and to the north by a coastline that a strong navy could defend. Ptolemy chose Egypt. He would never look back. His most audacious act came immediately. He intercepted Alexander's funeral cortege, the elaborate procession carrying the king's body back toward Macedonia, and diverted it to Egypt. Whether the body went first to Memphis or directly to Alexandria is debated by scholars. But the political meaning was unmistakable. Ptolemy now had Alexander. He could build a cult around the dead king, present himself as Alexander's chosen guardian, and let the propaganda do its work for generations. The third one was Antigonus I Monophthalmus, the one-eyed. He had lost his eye in battle decades before, and the scar had become part of his legend, already in his 60s when the succession wars began, an age at which most men of the ancient world were either dead or retired. Antigonus was still possessed of a physical energy and a strategic vision that none of his rivals could match. The other Diadochi wanted pieces of the empire. Antigonus wanted all of it. He was, in some ways, the most honest of them. He never pretended to be satisfied with a province. He alone, among all the successors, made a sustained and serious attempt to reunify Alexander's conquests under a single ruler. The fact that the ruler was himself is almost beside the point. Or, perhaps, it is entirely the point. He spent 2 decades in pursuit of that goal, and came closer to achieving it than anyone else ever would. Then was Seleucus. Of all the first-generation Diadochi, Seleucus may be the most underappreciated by popular history. He commanded Alexander's elite companion cavalry, the most prestigious military role in the Macedonian army, and served with distinction throughout the campaigns. But his greatest quality was not his skill on the battlefield, it was patience. Seleucus was capable of absorbing catastrophic setbacks and simply continuing. When he was driven out of Babylon by Antigonus in 316 BC, he did not collapse or negotiate from weakness. He fled to Ptolemy, waited, gathered resources, and returned. He reconquered Babylon in 312 BC and spent the next decade expanding eastward into Persia, into Bactria, all the way to the borders of India, building the Seleucid Empire from the ground up. While his rivals were destroying each other in the west, he would outlive every one of them. He would be the last of Alexander's first-generation generals still standing. The fifth general was Lysimachus, a former royal bodyguard assigned to the rugged frontier of Thrace, where other generals received wealthy satrapies with established administrative systems. Lysimachus received a region of unconquered tribes and constant border warfare. He fought his way to mastery of it over decades. He was a man shaped by a hard assignment, tough, methodical, not given to the spectacular gestures of men like Antigonus or Demetrius. His great failure when it came was personal rather than military. He had built everything over 40 years. He threw it away in a domestic tragedy. Cassander was the sixth one, the son of Antipater, Alexander's trusted regent in Macedonia. Cassander is, in many ways, the most straightforwardly ruthless of the Diadochi. Not the most ambitious, not the most visionary, but the most willing to cross lines that even his rivals hesitated at. He had Roxane and the young Alexander IV, the last Argead heir, quietly eliminated. He arranged the execution of Olympias, Alexander's own mother. He was not beloved, he was effective, and he died of illness in 297 BC, the only major Diadochos to die of natural causes before completing his political goals. Eumenes of Cardia, the seventh general of Alexander, the only non-Macedonian among the major players. And that mattered enormously. To the Macedonian military elite, Eumenes was an outsider, a Greek from the city of Cardia, a civilian administrator who had somehow risen into the highest councils of the empire. He had never commanded an army before the succession wars began. Yet, when he was given command, he proved to be one of the most gifted field generals of his age. His story is one of the most compelling in ancient history, not because he won, but because of how hard he made it for the men who eventually destroyed him. He twice defeated Macedonian armies in open battle. He outmaneuvered Antigonus in the mountains of Iran for 2 years. He was never decisively defeated in open battle. He was brought down not by an enemy, but by his own soldiers, men who chose their baggage over their commander. That betrayal will hit harder once you understand what it meant. The best general of the succession wars was destroyed not by Antigonus, but by the institution he served. The last one of Alexander's generals was Demetrius Poli or Satis, the besieger, the youngest of the major Diadochi, son of Antigonus, and one of the most gifted military tacticians of his generation. He earned his epithet at the siege of Rhodes in 305 to 304 BC, where he deployed siege technology the ancient world had never seen. Siege towers 9 stories high, catapults capable of throwing 300-pound projectiles, and still failed to take the city after a year of effort. Rhodes celebrated its survival, by melting down his abandoned siege equipment and casting the Colossus of Rhodes from the bronze, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Demetrius could win spectacular victories. He could not hold what he won. That gap between tactical brilliance and strategic consolidation would define and ultimately destroy him. Before the wars could begin, there had to be a settlement, or at least the appearance of one. In the chaotic days following Alexander's death, the senior generals gathered in Babylon to determine the fate of the empire. The negotiations were tense, fractured, and almost immediately violent. The Macedonian infantry supported Philip III Aridaeus, Alexander's cognitively impaired half-brother, as king. They distrusted the cavalry officers and the court elite. There were near riots in the streets of Babylon. The compromise reached was known as the Partition of Babylon. Philip III Aridaeus would be king. If Roxane's unborn child was a boy, he would be co-king. Perdiccas would hold Alexander's signet ring as regent. The effective power behind the throne, the empire's provinces, satrapies, would be distributed among the senior generals. The key assignments: Ptolemy received Egypt and Libya. Antigonus retained Phrygia, Lycia, and Pamphylia in Asia Minor. Lysimachus received Thrace. Eumenes was assigned Cappadocia and Paphlagonia, territories not yet fully conquered, meaning he would have to take them by force. Antipater remained in Macedonia as regent of Europe. Seleucus received a position in Babylon under Perdiccas's overall authority. On paper, it was an orderly division of a functioning empire. In practice, it was a starting gun. Perdiccas moved quickly to consolidate power, and in doing so, he made every mistake a man in his position could make. He conducted military operations against those who refused to accept the new order. He attempted to assert authority over generals who had no intention of accepting it. And he made the political miscalculation that would cost him his life. He sought to marry Cleopatra, Alexander's full sister, born of Philip II and Olympias. A marriage to Cleopatra would have given Perdiccas what he desperately lacked: a blood connection to the Argead royal house. It would have made him, in the eyes of the Macedonian world, not merely a regent serving the royal family, but a member of it. He held power, he needed legitimacy. This was how he planned to get it. He failed to understand, or chose to ignore, how this looked to every other major general in the empire. If Perdiccas married Cleopatra, his claim to supreme authority would become almost irresistible. The balance of power created by the partition of Babylon would collapse. Every other successor would become, in effect, a subordinate. The reaction was immediate and coordinated. Antipater, Antigonus, Craterus, and Ptolemy formed a coalition against Perdiccas. The First Diadochi War had begun. The war was fought on 2 fronts. In the west, Craterus and Antipater crossed the Hellespont into Asia Minor. They encountered Eumenes, fighting on Perdiccas's behalf, in Cappadocia. The battle took place at Orcynia in 320 BC. Eumenes won, and Craterus, one of the most popular generals in the entire Macedonian army, a man whose soldiers had loved him with a devotion that bordered on the personal, was killed in the fighting. Ancient sources say that Eumenes, who had known Craterus personally for years, wept when he learned what had happened. He had the body treated with full honors and sent to Craterus's widow in Macedonia. It was a gesture of genuine grief mixed with political calculation. Eumenes knew that killing Craterus would mark him, in Macedonian eyes, as a man who had taken a step too far. But the real disaster for Perdiccas came not from the west, but from the south. He invaded Egypt. The logic seemed sound: destroy Ptolemy, and the coalition would collapse. But Perdiccas badly underestimated both the defensive strength of Egypt and Ptolemy's military competence. The Egyptian campaign was a catastrophe. Twice his forces attempted to cross the Nile near Memphis. Twice they were driven back. The current ran faster than his engineers had calculated. The crossing points were narrow. The river banks opposite were held by Ptolemy's forces, who knew every approach. And in the chaos of the failed crossings, the Nile's other inhabitants intervened. The crocodiles took men by the dozens. Perdiccas's own officers turned on him. The conspiracy included Seleucus and Python, two of his most senior subordinates. They entered his tent and killed him. Perdiccas, who had held Alexander's signet ring, who had been the most powerful man in the empire, was assassinated in his own camp by the men he commanded. Ptolemy was immediately offered the regency of the empire. He declined it. It was, perhaps, the smartest political decision of the entire succession crisis. Ptolemy understood that the regent's role was a target. He had Egypt, he had Alexandria, he had Alexander's body, he had everything he needed. The new settlement was negotiated at Triparadisos in Syria in 320 BC. Seleucus received Babylon, his first acquisition of the province. That would become the heart of his empire. Antigonus was given supreme command in Asia, with explicit instructions to pursue and destroy Eumenes. The partition of Triparadisos failed for the same reason the partition of Babylon had failed. It assumed the men involved would be satisfied with what they were given. None of them were. Antipater died in 319 BC in Macedonia. His death was of natural causes, but his final political decision reignited the entire succession crisis. He bypassed his own son Cassander and named Polyperchon, a loyal but undistinguished general, as regent. Whatever the reason, Cassander had no intention of accepting the decision. He immediately allied with Antigonus and began planning to retake Macedonia by force. This reshuffling of alliances gave Eumenes his moment. Aligned with Polyperchon, Eumenes was given command in Asia, and to support his campaign, Polyperchon gave him access to Alexander's most legendary unit, the Silver Shields. The Argyraspides, the Silver Shields, were Alexander's personal infantry guard, the elite of the elite. They had been formed from veteran phalangites, who had served for decades and proven their worth in every major engagement. Of the eastern campaigns, by 319 BC, many of them were in their 50s and 60s, ancient for active soldiers in the ancient world, but they were still undefeated in open battle. They carried Alexander's campaigns on their painted shields. They were the living embodiment of Macedonian military invincibility. Eumenes, the outsider, the Greek secretary who had become a general, understood what having the silver shields meant. It gave him a legitimacy in the eyes of the Macedonian rank and file that his origins could never provide. These men had served the king. They still served the king's memory, and Eumenes would use that loyalty brilliantly for as long as it lasted. The campaign in Asia was fought across the vast distances of the Iranian plateau, in terrain that tested logistics as much as tactics. Antigonus pursued Eumenes into the Iranian highlands. The two armies fought their first major engagement at Par-Etasin, in the region of modern Isfahan, in 317 BC. Par-Etasin was a brutal, close-quarters engagement on rocky highland terrain. The Silver Shields performed exactly as their legend demanded. They shattered everything in front of them on the right wing, driving back Antigonus's forces with a professional efficiency. That was genuinely awe-inspiring, even to men who had seen decades of Macedonian warfare. But Antigonus held on the left and center. The battle ended without a decisive result. Both sides withdrew to winter quarters to rest, resupply, and prepare for the following year. The decisive confrontation came the following year at Gabiene, fought in the depths of an Iranian winter, across a salt desert where the dust was fine enough to blind men and horses. The battle opened much as Paratacine had, the silver shields driving forward on the right, with their terrible, grinding efficiency. And then Antigonus executed a maneuver that had nothing to do with fighting and everything to do with human nature. He sent his cavalry on a long circuit around the battlefield, not to strike the enemy's flank, not to pursue fleeing soldiers, but to find the Silver Shield's baggage camp, and there, undefended, they found everything the veterans had accumulated. Over decades of campaigning, their savings, their plunder, their equipment, and their families. When word reached the Silver Shields that their baggage had been captured, they stopped fighting, simply stopped. These men had followed Alexander to India and back. They had defeated every enemy placed in front of them for 30 years, and they stopped for their luggage. They sent a message to Antigonus. They would hand over Eumenes, alive, in exchange for the return of their possessions. Antigonus agreed, the outsider, the man who had risen too far in a world that never fully accepted him, the general who was never decisively defeated in open battle, handed over by his own soldiers for the price of their luggage. Antigonus held him for several days. His officers debated what to do. Antigonus ultimately had him quietly eliminated. As for the Silver Shields, Antigonus dispersed them to the most distant and dangerous frontier postings he could find. He reportedly told the officers responsible that he never wanted to see their faces again. History records none of them returning from those assignments. The best soldiers the ancient world had ever produced, who had never been defeated in open battle, were destroyed by their own priorities. With Eumenes dead, Antigonus was the undisputed master of Asia. He controlled Asia Minor, Syria, and Mesopotamia, a continuous block of territory stretching from the Aegean coast to the Persian Gulf. His treasury was enormous. His army was the largest and most experienced in the Hellenistic world, and his ambition, never concealed, was now fully declared. He wanted to reunify Alexander's empire under his own rule. He was not subtle about it. His rivals could read the situation as clearly as he could. Ptolemy, Cassander, Lysimachus, and Seleucus, who had recently fled Babylon after Antigonus tried to remove him, formed a grand coalition in 315 BC. By this point, the succession wars had been raging for nearly a decade, and nothing, not a single major question, about the future of Alexander's empire had been decided. The same men were still fighting. The same territories were changing hands and changing back. The ancient world had been in a state of continuous large-scale warfare for 8 years, and the end was nowhere in sight. Antigonus's strategic response to the coalition was a masterpiece of political warfare. He issued a proclamation addressed to the Greek cities of Asia and Europe, declaring the freedom of the Greeks. All Greek cities, he announced, should be autonomous. They should be free from garrisons. They should govern themselves. It was completely cynical. Antigonus had no intention of allowing genuinely autonomous cities in his own territories. Cities without garrisons were cities he could not control. But the proclamation was aimed not at his own cities, but at Cassander's. Cassander maintained Macedonian garrisons throughout Greece. The freedom of the Greeks was a propaganda weapon pointed directly at Cassander's legitimacy, forcing him onto the defensive. It worked. Several Greek cities revolted. Cassander spent years suppressing them. The decisive engagement of this phase came at Gaza in 312 BC. Ptolemy and Seleucus moved north into Syria and defeated Demetrius, Antigonus' son, near the ancient city. What happened immediately afterward was more important than the battle itself. Seleucus, with a small force, perhaps a few thousand men, marched east from Gaza. He crossed the Syrian desert, entered Mesopotamia, and within months had reconquered Babylon. The Babylonian Chronicle records the precise astronomical date. This moment is now known as Year 1 of the Seleucid era, a dating system that the peoples of Mesopotamia, Syria, and Persia would use for over 5 centuries, long after the Seleucid Empire itself had ceased to exist. Antigonus sent Demetrius east to retake Babylon. Demetrius raided, captured parts of the city, held the citadel briefly, and was ultimately unable to dislodge Seleucus, who had the support of the local population behind him. Demetrius withdrew. Seleucus began expanding east into Persia, into Media, into Bactria. Each year, his base grew larger and more secure. By 311 BC, all parties were exhausted. The Peace of 311 BC formally recognized the territorial status quo: Cassander in Macedonia, Lysimachus in Thrace, Ptolemy in Egypt, Antigonus in Asia. The settlement pointedly excluded Seleucus. He did not care. He was already building something larger than any peace treaty could contain. In the months following the peace, Cassander did something that cast a shadow over his own legacy for the rest of history. He had Roxane and the young Alexander IV, Alexander's son, the last heir of the Argead royal dynasty, quietly eliminated. The boy was perhaps 13 years old. With Alexander IV's death, the last pretense of a legitimate unified empire was gone. No one had been fighting for the royal family for years. Everyone knew that. But as long as the heir lived, there was at least a theoretical framework. Now even that was gone. Every man who had claimed to fight in the king's name could now stop the pretense. The empire was not to be reunified. It was to be divided, and the only question left was who would draw the lines. In 306 BC, Demetrius destroyed Ptolemy's fleet at the naval battle of Salamis of Cyprus. Antigonus responded by doing what no one had formally done since Alexander's death. He declared himself king, not regent, not strategos, not commander, king of all Asia in the tradition of Alexander. The others had no choice but to respond in kind. Ptolemy declared himself king of Egypt within months. Seleucus followed in the east, Lysimachus in Thrace, Cassander in Macedonia. Within 2 years of Antigonus's proclamation, 5 separate kings ruled 5 separate portions of what had been one empire. Stop for a moment and consider what this meant. This was a formal declaration gauged by the men who had known Alexander personally, who had served him, who had seen his vision up close, that his world would never be whole again. The empire was dead. Kingdoms were born. The proclamations of 306 to 304 BC stripped away the last pretense. This was now a world of kingdoms. The only remaining question was how many and where their borders would fall. Antigonus made one last major demonstration of supremacy before the inevitable confrontation with the coalition. In 305 BC, Demetrius launched the Great Siege of Rhodes. He arrived with a fleet, an army, and an engineering corps. whose ambition would define his reputation forever. The siege lasted over a year. Demetrius deployed siege towers of unprecedented size. The Helepolis, or city taker, was 9 stories tall, 60 feet wide, and moved on wheels, crewed by hundreds of men. He still couldn't take the city. Roads held, supplied by sea, defended with a resourcefulness that earned the admiration of the ancient world. When Demetrius finally negotiated a withdrawal, the Rhodians melted down his abandoned siege equipment and cast the Colossus of Rhodes from the bronze, a monument to their survival, a monument to his failure. Demetrius kept the name Polyorketes, the besieger. He wore his failure as a badge of honor, because the alternative was to admit that he had spent a year and lost. By 301 BC, the political situation had crystallized into its final form. Antigonus controlled Asia Minor and Syria. Seleucus controlled Mesopotamia and Persia. Lysimachus controlled Thrace and the northern Aegean coast. Cassander controlled Macedonia and Greece. And the fundamental tension had reached the point where only a decisive military confrontation could resolve it. Antigonus's ambition to reunify the empire versus everyone else's determination that he would not. The coalition assembled against Antigonus in 302 BC was the largest coordinated military effort of the entire succession crisis. Lysimachus crossed into Asia Minor from the north. Seleucus moved west from Mesopotamia. Cassander sent forces east, and Ptolemy, characteristically, occupied the southern Levant, rather than committing his main forces. The armies converged near the town of Ipsus in Phrygia, the interior of modern Turkey. Seleucus had one weapon that no other general in the Hellenistic world possessed: in significant numbers, war elephants. He had obtained them through one of the most consequential diplomatic arrangements of the ancient world, around 305 BC, rather than attempting a full-scale Indian campaign, which had broken even Alexander's army. Seleucus negotiated with Chandragupta Maurya. He ceded the territories that are now Afghanistan and Pakistan. In exchange, he received 500 war elephants. The exchange was widely criticized in antiquity as a giveaway of conquered territory. In retrospect, it was the decisive investment of the succession crisis. At Ipsus, Seleucus brought approximately 480 of these animals. Nothing in the Greek or Macedonian military tradition had a reliable answer for war elephants deployed in numbers. They terrified horses, they disrupted formations, and their sheer physical mass was a barrier that infantry could not quickly penetrate. The battle unfolded in a way that demonstrated the difference between tactical genius and strategic judgment. Demetrius commanded Antigonus's cavalry on the right wing. He performed brilliantly. His horsemen shattered the opposing cavalry and drove them from the field. But Demetrius kept going. He pursued the fleeing cavalry far beyond the battlefield, carried away by the momentum of victory. He took himself out of the engagement at the exact moment when his presence could have changed everything. Seleucus, watching from the opposite side, recognized the moment immediately. He moved his war elephants, not forward, not into the main infantry engagement, but laterally across the line of Demetrius's potential return. Not to crush the enemy directly, to block the gap, to prevent Demetrius from coming back to his father's army. That is what decided the Battle of Ipsus. Not a great cavalry charge, not a dramatic phalanx engagement. A wall of elephants, positioned between a son and his father. At the moment when the father needed him most, Antigonus's infantry, now unsupported on the flanks, was slowly enveloped. The old king refused to retreat. He sat on his horse and reportedly told anyone who would listen that Demetrius would return, that his son would break through, that the battle was not yet lost. Demetrius did not return in time. Antigonus the One-Eyed, the man who had spent 20 years trying to put Alexander's world back together, who had come closer to that goal than any other man alive, who had fought his first battle before Alexander was born, was killed by a volley of javelins. He was approximately 81 years old. He died on the battlefield in full armor, having refused to flee. Ipsus ended the dream of a reunified empire. 3 kingdoms now dominated the Hellenistic world. Not 2, not 1, 3. The 20 years between Ipsus and the final Diadochi War are often treated as an epilogue, a winding down of the main drama. They were not. Demetrius was the most unexpected figure of this period. Shattered at Ipsus, stripped of his father's Asian empire, left with only a fleet and a collection of Greek cities, he rebuilt. Cassander died in 297 BC. He left 3 sons who immediately began fighting each other for Macedonia. Demetrius watched. He waited for his moment. In 294 BC, Demetrius invaded Macedonia, killed Cassander's son, Alexander V, and made himself king. He ruled Macedonia with the style the Macedonians found deeply alien. Persian court ceremony, elaborate dress, strict protocols of access. His soldiers, who expected their king to be accessible, to drink with them, grew to resent him. He was planning something enormous, a reconquest of Asia, a campaign to undo Ipsus. His ambition, like his father's, would not accept the settlement the world had offered. Lysimachus and Pyrrhus of Epirus invaded Macedonia simultaneously in 288 BC. They did not need to fight a battle. Demetrius's army simply defected. His soldiers walked across to the other side. Demetrius fled to Asia. He launched what amounted to a guerrilla campaign against Seleucus. He found none of the support he needed. He sent messages to Seleucus asking for terms. Seleucus's terms were this: surrender. Demetrius accepted. He was held under comfortable but effective imprisonment. He reportedly drank himself to death over the next 2 years. He died in 283 BC at the age of approximately 54. By 281 BC, 40 years had passed since Alexander's death. Most of the men who had stood at his bedside in Babylon were long dead, killed in battle, assassinated, consumed by their own ambitions, or carried off by illness. 2 of the original first generation Diadochi remained. Lysimachus controlled Macedonia, Thrace, and Asia Minor, the largest contiguous block of territory in the northern Hellenistic world. He should, by any reasonable calculation, have been able to spend his remaining years consolidating what he had built. He destroyed himself with a domestic decision. His second wife, Arsinoe II, a daughter of Ptolemy I, a woman of exceptional political intelligence and ruthlessness, convinced Lysimachus that his own son and heir Agathocles was plotting against him. Agathocles was popular with the army, capable, widely respected. Whether he was actually conspiring against his father is unknown. Lysimachus had him executed. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. Agathocles' widow fled to Seleucus, urging him to act. Senior officers began defecting, unwilling to serve a king who had killed his own heir on the word of a politically motivated queen. Seleucus invaded. The Battle of Corupedium was fought on the plains of Lydia in 281 BC. Lysimachus was killed in the fighting. He was approximately 80 years old. the last of Alexander's original senior commanders to die in open battle. Seleucus stood alone, the last surviving first-generation Diadochos. He had outlived every man who had gathered in that chamber in Babylon 40 years before. He had survived the assassination of Perdiccas, the destruction of Eumenes, the long years in exile, the loss of Babylon, and its recovery, the coalition against Antigonus, 7 distinct phases of war. He crossed into Europe to claim Macedonia. He was nearly 80 years old. He was days away from ruling the entire Hellenistic world. He had survived every war, but not peace. Ptolemy I was the eldest son of Ptolemy I, bypassed for the succession of Egypt, a royal prince without a kingdom. He had ended up at Seleucus's court, where he was treated as an honored guest. Near the Hellespont, in the spring of 281 BC, Ptolemy Ceraunus killed Seleucus, a guest killing his host, a ward killing his patron. Seleucus, who had survived every enemy the Hellenistic world could produce, was killed by the man he had sheltered. The man who had outlasted everyone was murdered by a guest. The aftermath was chaos of a different kind. Ptolemy Ceraunus briefly seized Macedonia, only to be killed when a massive Gallic raiding force invaded the Balkans in 279 BC. Macedonia entered years of instability, until Antigonus Gonatas, son of Demetrius, finally stabilized it following his defeat of the Gauls in 277 BC. The Diadochi era was over. Their kingdoms endured 40 years of war, hundreds of thousands of dead, the murder of a dynasty, the execution of generals who had conquered the known world. And what emerged from all of it? They destroyed a kingdom, and in doing so, they built a world. When Ptolemy I died in 282 BC, peacefully, having abdicated in favor of his son 2 years earlier, at the age of approximately 84. He left behind an institution that would endure for nearly 3 centuries. Alexandria, its capital, was a city unlike anything the ancient world had seen. The Library of Alexandria, the Mausion, collected manuscripts from across the known world, at its height housing hundreds of thousands of scrolls. Euclid developed his geometry there. Eratosthenes calculated the circumference of the earth there, with an accuracy that would not be matched for over 1,000 years. The first systematic anatomical dissections in recorded history took place in its medical schools. The Pharos Lighthouse, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, was over 100 meters tall and visible from 30 miles at sea. It stood for over 15 centuries. The dynasty ruled Egypt for 275 years through 15 rulers. It ended not on a battlefield, but when Cleopatra VII faced Rome and fell. The dynasty that began with a Macedonian general's pragmatic choice at a deathbed in Babylon endured for nearly 3 centuries and ended in one of the most dramatic final acts in ancient history. The largest of the successor states by territory, at its peak stretching from the Aegean coast to the borders of India. A swath of land covering modern Turkey, Syria, Lebanon, Israel, Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. The Seleucids founded dozens of cities across Mesopotamia, Persia, and Central Asia, creating nodes of Hellenistic culture that functioned as administrative centers, military colonies, and cultural bridges between the Greek world and the civilizations of the East. Seleucia on the Tigris became one of the largest cities in the ancient world. Antioch on the Orontes would later become one of the first major centers of early Christianity. The empire eventually fragmented. To the Parthians from the east, to Rome from the west, but its cultural reach was irreversible. The Hellenistic civilization the Seleucids spread through the Middle East shaped the cultural matrix into which both Christianity and Islam would later emerge. Of the three great successor kingdoms, the Antigonid state had the most troubled birth. Following Ipsus, the Antigonid cause seemed finished, yet the dynasty survived through the stability established by Antigonus Gonatas. His decisive moment came in 277 BC, when he met and destroyed a large Gallic force that had been raiding the Balkans for 2 years. He had defended Macedonia from barbarian invasion. The Macedonians remembered. The Antigonids ruled for over a century, until the Roman legions ended it at the Battle of Pydna in 168 BC, ending Macedonian independence permanently. After nearly 5 centuries as an independent political entity, Macedonia ceased to exist as a sovereign state, and beyond these three great kingdoms, a dozen smaller states born from the same 40 years. Pergamon, whose library rivaled Alexandria's, and whose name gave us the word parchment. Pontus, whose king Mithridates VI would become Rome's most dangerous enemy. Epirus, whose king Pyrrhus took his armies to Italy, and gave history the term Pyrrhic victory, a triumph so expensive in casualties as to be strategically indistinguishable from a defeat. This is the part of history that is easy to miss when you are counting the dead and the burning cities. The Diadochi destroyed Alexander's unity. They murdered his son, they murdered his mother, they killed each other with the persistence that borders on the obsessive, and in doing so, they built a world. The Hellenistic civilization that emerged from their wars was not an accident. It was the direct product of three competing kingdoms, each trying to outshine the others in wealth, cultural prestige, intellectual achievement, and political sophistication. That competition drove the library of Alexandria. It drove the mathematics of Euclid and the geometry of Archimedes. It drove the astronomy of Hipparchus and the medicine of Herophilus. Rome inherited this world. The Roman Republic and Empire absorbed the Hellenistic kingdoms one by one, but they absorbed their culture as well, their art, their philosophy, their science, their languages. Roman civilization as we understand it. The civilization that formed the basis of Western European culture was built on Hellenistic foundations that the Diadochi constructed from the wreckage of Alexander's empire. The Byzantine Empire, which preserved Greek learning through the medieval period, was the direct heir of the Hellenistic East, the Islamic Golden Age of the 8th through 13th centuries, which preserved the mathematics, medicine, and philosophy of the ancient world, drew directly on texts compiled and developed in Hellenistic libraries. When European scholars rediscovered Aristotle and Euclid and Galen in the 12th and 13th centuries, they were recovering knowledge that had traveled from Athens to Alexandria to Baghdad and back again, a journey made possible by the world the Diadochi built. What they destroyed was unity. What they created was something far more enduring. Alexander dreamed of a world empire, a single political entity ruled by one man with one law and one culture. His generals could not build that. They were too ambitious, too competitive, too human. But in failing to build Alexander's empire, they built something he could never have built himself: a world culture, a shared intellectual and artistic tradition that crossed political borders, survived the destruction of the kingdoms that created it, and formed the foundation on which the next 2,000 years of human civilization would rest. Alexander built an empire in 12 years. His generals spent 40 trying to decide who owned it, and in the process they gave the world far more than he ever could. 40 years, 8 generals, 3 kingdoms, 1 fallen dream. The wars of the Diadochi are the story of what happens when the greatest empire the ancient world ever built dies without an heir, and when the men who built it decide that sharing it was never an option. On this channel, we follow the evidence, we flag the debates, we verify the sources. We trace history not as legend, but as it actually happened. In our next episode in the Wars That Built Kingdoms series, we move forward 2000 years to the bloodiest and most transformative conflict of the modern age. An emperor who, like Alexander, built an empire in less than a decade, who remade the map of Europe with bayonets and genius, who crowned himself king of Italy, placed his brothers on the thrones of Spain and Westphalia, and forced every major European power to its knees, and who, like Antigonus, died having watched everything he built collapse around him, his marshals turning against him, his empire partitioned among his enemies, his dynasty erased, the Napoleonic Wars, 1803 to 1815, a war that built kingdoms and buried an entire world order. That is next, documented, verified, chronological.